Listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to our first webinar in the 2015 series. We have about a minute here before we get started, so we'll wait that minute. Most everyone's connected. You should have on your screen two things. You should have a video box that shows me. That was a request from our test webinar in November. And also you should have a PowerPoint presentation which was sent to you yesterday by email, but that should also be showing on your screen. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Over to the right of your screen should be a control panel. We are monitoring questions as we go, so if you have a question, something's not clear, you have a comment that is relevant right at that moment, please look over on your control panel, and there's at the bottom should be an icon for chat. So if it's showing a plus, if you'll just click on that, it will bring up a text box and you can type in your question there. So we encourage questions. We'll monitor those as we go. If something's unclear, we'll address it immediately, and trying to leave about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for more questions. So please feel free to use that. If you're having any problem viewing or hearing, go ahead and send that. Somebody's watching for those types of issues too, and we'll try to help you out there. So I'm Kathy Ligon, and thanks again for being here. We're really excited about this financial webinar series for 2015. This is our first. We did hold a test webinar in November. We had 54 participants there. So if you're back, thank you for being back, and thank you for the comments and suggestions, and we tried to incorporate as many of those as possible. Today we maxed out with 100 participants, so that was very exciting for us. We will post this series on our website. We'll also shortly post the one that we held in November, which was healthy financial control, and you should be able to access those from the website in the future. And we'll net out to people who wanted to participate but weren't able to because of the size limit. Today, like I said, we have 100 participants. They're from 32 states, British Columbia, and Puerto Rico, so really exciting there. We've got a wide variety of people. I think that you guys will learn as much from each other as me, so again, feel free to add comments and questions. We have people who are directors, we have company owners, we have franchise companies, we have national organizations, we have nonprofits, we have some community type organizations. So we'll try to make this relevant to everyone as much as possible, and hopefully everyone can get something out of it. There will also be a follow-up survey from this one, so comments are appreciated. Again, whatever ideas you guys have for the future, you know, we'll certainly consider. We do have our April, so we'll hold 6 webinars this year. We do have our April webinar scheduled. It will be held on the 23rd, and that one will be on accounts receivable, policies, and control, a big issue with a lot of people, and we've got a lot of requests for that. So take a look at that, and we'll send you a reminder a week or 2 ahead of time. Also, we have an article coming out on accounts receivable management in Childcare Information Exchange that I think is in their March-April issue. So that should come out about the same time. Refer to that. And there are a few articles on accounts receivable, tuition rates, and other financial topics on our website. We try to be a financial resource for folks in the industry because I'm sure, as you guys know, and evidenced by the number of people we have participating, that there's a big lack of that type of information in our industry. And because we work with a lot of different people, we're privy to a lot of information, so we try to pass that along when we can. So I'd like to kick off with a story that I tell frequently when I'm doing seminars and webinars. And the longer I'm in this industry, which will be 29 years this summer, the funnier the story gets to me. My first experience in childcare was when my daughter entered childcare about 33 years ago, which is scary to think now. At the time, I was an accountant working in public accounting, so I really should understand how companies work and the financial situations in companies. But I would go in to pick her up, and I would go into the classroom and count the little heads in the room, multiply that by the $45 a week full-time tuition rate that these people were charging me, and wonder how they could be charging me so much, and was convinced that they were getting rich off of my $45 a week. So the longer I'm in the industry, the funnier that gets, because 2 years later, that same company, which was a 5-site childcare organization, needed some help with their financials, so I took a position over there. Intending for that to be a short-term position, ended up staying 18 years because, as we know, this is a great industry and we all love it. But I found out that the story was completely different. So I was working with people who were regularly leveraging their home to make payroll. They were squeezing every dollar to pay teachers. They were constantly trying to figure out how to give benefits. I think at the time we gave 2 vacation days a year and half-price childcare, and that was all we could afford. So what I found out was that the situation in the industry was very, very different from what I thought. So it was an interesting combination for me with the background in accounting and the love of the industry and the people, and trying to help support people who were doing great things for children. So that's how I got my start, and boy, have I been educated since. So I'm excited that this first webinar is on tuition rates, because there are really 2 things in the industry that we see on a regular basis that get people in trouble with their companies if they aren't set up correctly. And tuition rates is one of those, and when I tell you the second one, it really falls back to tuition rates as well. So let me tell you what I have prepared for today. What we would like to talk about, it's taking PowerPoint just a minute to get me to the second slide here. Try that again. There we go. Okay, I'm not the best technology person. So what I'd like to talk about today is first positioning your business, and what do tuition rates have to do with positioning your business. I'd like to talk about, if you're at the beginning of your business cycle, how do you set your tuition rates? How do you know what you should do to set your tuition rates? And then what do you do about increasing your tuition rates? The fourth one is what I'm talking to most people about these days is, okay, I'm behind. What in the world do I do now? I need to get caught up. And there are certain strategies that I found to be successful there. Then I'd like to talk about other things that bring money into the school other than the tuition. And lastly, discounts. And I encourage you to hang on to discounts. If there's something slow in the middle, hang on to that and wait for that conversation, because that is also an area that people get in trouble with. So, and sometimes more important than the actual tuition rate. If you're giving away too much of your tuition, then that can get you in as much or more trouble than the actual tuition rate. So that's where we're headed. Okay, first of all, about positioning your business. I like to say to people that I meet so many people who have, actually everyone in this industry has the best intentions. They want to serve people, they want to serve children, they are concerned about families, as I am, and certainly don't want anything in what I have to say today to mean that I'm not sensitive to the limits of families to pay certain tuition rates. But what I see is that they get themselves in trouble personally. And my message to people is that if you aren't caring for yourself financially and you aren't thriving financially, there's no way that you can support other people. So I see so many people that They don't want to raise rates on their families. They don't think they can afford it. They're struggling to pay teachers. They're struggling to pay benefits. They're up at night worried about how they're going to make the next payment. And then, you know, all the way to people who we get the call when they're in bankruptcy and they need to sell. So that is not what I want for other people. I want people to be very proactive about matching their tuition rates with their service and charging the right amount, because we want to be at the end of your company cycle when you go out ahead. And we don't want to get the call that you're in trouble and you need to do something, because I know how hard you guys are working. And I say this to people regularly: whatever you're charging, it isn't enough. And I say that in a funny way, but really I know how hard you guys are working, and we need to be more aggressive as an industry on what we charge for our services and match those up. So hopefully you'll get some good ideas for those today. Another thing to mention too is that in some cases, I think that as people evaluate different companies in our industry, tuition rates are the only, maybe not the only, but they're a big factor in how they determine quality. And I say that just because, you know, they look at the facility and it needs to be nice, and they see a person briefly in the morning and briefly in the afternoon, but for them to know and really understand how a quality educational company looks isn't always the case. So there are a lot of people who will perceive you it's not as good as if your rates are lower than the market. So just, you know, just something to think about there as you're positioning. So let's talk a little bit about setting initial rates. And this is actually an exercise I like for everyone to go through, whether you're starting a new business or whether you're in business and you're trying to figure out what your rate should be. So if you're starting your company, it is important to look at what the competition is doing and take a market survey. But to me, that's the least important part of setting your rates. So many times people are afraid to increase their rates to the point that it makes sense for the service that they're providing because their competitors are not there. And I would encourage you to think less about that, because in so many cases, and the industry's great, people talk to each other all the time, what are you doing for your rates, what are you going to do next year, and they try to stay with the market, which is important, but I see that pulling everyone down because everyone's afraid to do anything and they don't want to be out of reach. I would not be afraid of positioning yourself above the market. There are some of the franchise groups, and we've got some franchise groups on the call today, and I work with some of you guys and really like what you're doing in the market. But these guys are not afraid to come into new markets, and they've got some pretty aggressive growth plans in the next year and couple of years. But they're not afraid to come into the market at a much higher tuition rate, $40 to $60 above the highest other provider in town, which is pretty aggressive if you think about whether you would want to be at that point as compared to your other competitors. But I wouldn't be afraid of that. I really like at least $10 ahead. You know, your house has to be in order, so let me say that. You have to be providing excellent services. That's somebody else's job to help you with. But financially, as long as that is the case, then don't be afraid of setting your tuition rates at a point where they're above the competition, and don't apologize for that. The next thing I'd like to say is that instead of that being the driving force, what I'd like for you to get good at is setting your rates to match the cost of your services. So it's a little outside the scope of this discussion, but I will offer up that we have, if you haven't had access to it before, we have a financial benchmarking tool. You can input your license capacity, your tuition rate, your revenue, and the cost of your building, whether that's rent or a lease payment, because that's a big factor in your financial picture. The rest of the fields will populate according to what most of the market spends. And I started this analysis about 20 years ago and temper it constantly, but it rarely changes. And that is comforting, I think. You know, I have people sometimes say, do you want to give out that same information again? Well, yes, I do. And the good thing about that is that it is that the basics of our industry financially don't change that much. And if you're very good at 4 or 5 things, then, you know, the chances are that you'll be successful. Those 4 or 5 things are that your tuition rates need to be set to match your services. Your rent and mortgage payment cannot be over a certain threshold. There's some industry standards, and we're happy to help people as they make decisions about either a new school, rent increases, acquisitions. You know, you guys just feel free to use us as a resource. We don't charge people to give opinions, and we're always happy to talk about numbers. So there is a certain threshold you should spend there. As long as you're controlling your 2 main controllables, which are staff cost and food cost, and you're collecting your money, which is the topic of the April webinar. If you do those 4 things really well, then we're a pretty basic industry and not much changes financially. The things that I have seen change really in 20 years, there have been 2 things that have changed, not even significantly, but slightly. One is employee benefits, as people are trying to implement health care and make changes there. Those costs have gone up. At the same time, I see a pretty good shift downward in advertising cost as social media marketing is more effective and less expensive than what we used to do, which was newspaper, yellow pages, and things that don't exist anymore and were very expensive. So that's good news. Besides that, if you take that financial model and you work toward it, it's pretty basic. And as you get better and better at it and look at more aspects of it, it will help you in your business. So let me drive that back to the tuition rate. You can use this tool to input your actual cost of services and play with the tuition rate until you get to a place where there's a plus number on the bottom. And the reason, you know, besides the fact that you deserve to make a living at what you're doing every day, you also need a plus number because you need to make reinvestments back into your company. So if that's not a plus number, then there are no buses and there's no playground equipment. There are no benefits for the people who are there working really hard for you every day. So that's a good tool to use that for. Again, you know, to explain that in a little more detail is really outside of the time limit that we have here. We're happy to be a resource for people if they want to say, you know, I really need help with matching what my tuition rate should be based on where my company is. So happy to help anyone with that. But again, that's a much more logical route to take than being so worried about what your competition is doing. I'd like to, I think you get it now, where I'm going with this next comment, which is that this is one of the 2 most common financial mistakes that people make. So if you are giving people as a service more than they're paying you for, it just doesn't match up. You know, this is true of any industry. If you're selling clothes and it costs you more to buy them than your customers are paying for them, you're not going to make it there. So there's a problem. The second one that I mentioned a few minutes ago was that a lot of people, I call it overbuild their facility. There are certain limits based on the revenue that the industry can tolerate as far as rent and mortgage payments. And you really could take this back to the tuition rate. So if you've spent too much on a building, it's all based on what the tuition rate and the capacity is. So as long as the tuition rate matches up with that, then you're okay. So really, I can draw both of the most common mistakes back to the tuition rate. Before we leave this setting initial rates, just a comment that there are some markets that are more price sensitive than others. You need to know your market. There are a lot of people who operate in areas where parents receive help for their tuition in the form of subsidies, and typically government subsidies that are driven through the Childcare Development Block Grant. And in some states, you aren't able to charge parents the difference. So that's a challenge. I have a lot of respect for people who operate those programs. They do an incredibly high quality job. They try to keep those programs affordable for families, and in some states you can charge the difference between what you're providing and what the subsidy will pay. In some states you can't even do that, so you have to make the decision to do that or not. I did hear a very creative suggestion from someone that they scholarship the difference, or maybe they scholarship a child or two. It's a great way to get some good marketing out of it. You know, I certainly think we do a lot of great things in this industry that don't get promoted enough and don't get communicated down to parents. So that's something that might help you out a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about annual rate increases. You're in business now, and you notice that, whoops, okay, don't want to go there yet. I think I clicked too many times. Okay. So my strength is financials, not PowerPoint and technology. All right, so you'll notice that the title of this slide is annual rate increases. Too many times recently, I'm talking with people who haven't raised their rates in 3 years. They haven't raised their rates in 5 years, and I was in complete agreement with that in 2009 and 10 when parents were struggling more than usual. Jobs were in jeopardy. People were concerned. They didn't want to hurt their enrollment, and it made sense. But then they just stopped, really, and that's not healthy because there's a limit to how much you can catch up, really. And if you've fallen way behind, I've got some ideas for you. I've been talking about this at some seminars recently, and participants have given me some great ideas, so I'll share some of those with you. First of all, set a precedence for annual rate increases. Just do it systematically. What time of year is a question to people. Some people like to do it in the fall. Some people like to stay away from that because they don't want that to be a factor in enrollment. They might do it in January or maybe March. So those are some thoughts, but set a precedence and do it regularly. How much is okay? There is a tolerance level to how much you can increase current parents at once. Most people will use about 5%, 5 to 8%, or $5 to $10. It seems difficult to raise tuition on current families more than $10 a week. Some individual cases can tolerate more, but that's what most companies use for a standard. So one of the things that I say to people is do the math on this thing. So many people are afraid that they'll lose enrollment, and that's what we're all about. We're all about the enrollment. If you're not well enrolled, then nothing else falls in place. So most companies will break even at about 50 to 60% enrollment. Most companies can have a decent bottom line for reinvestment at 70%. So at 70%, I like to see 12 to 15% on the bottom line. But what happens after that is almost every new tuition dollar falls straight to the bottom line because your teachers are in place and you need a few more supplies, but not much else. So that's the real sweet spot. But everyone's afraid of losing enrollment, and they should be. Again, it's the driver in the financial picture of our industry. But what I say to people is do the math. So let's assume that you have 100 children enrolled, and you plan to do a 5% increase. How many children can you lose and still make the same amount of money? So obviously in this case, if you're raising 5% and you have 100 children, you can lose 5, and you are still making the exact same amount of money. What's happening to the bottom line, though, is that you're making more money because you're not actually providing services to those 5 that you lost. But here's the more important message. Almost never are families lost for tuition increases. Again, I have to say that your house has to be in order. So if you lose a significant number of people because there's a rate increase, my suggestion would be to you that there's another problem. There's an operational problem in your school. And I really like for participants at this point to be able to see each other, because when I say how many people put in a rate increase in the last 2 years, and, you know, of course, hands, how many people actually lost families because of that? I might get 1 or 2 hands, and when you ask the question about how many families they lost, maybe 1 or 2. And everyone always says, I completely overreacted to that. It wasn't nearly as devastating as I thought, and it really improved my financial picture. So I want to talk about how to communicate to families, though, because, again, communication, you can really communicate most anything in a positive way. So be sure that when you do your tuition rate increases, you communicate that in a way to families that tells them the positive things that have happened and are going to happen in your school that justify that tuition rate increase. So be sure that you start with that. Here's what we've accomplished in the last 12 months. Here's where we're headed in the next 12 months. Always a focus on staff, because you aren't going to be able to do annual increases for staff if you aren't doing annual tuition rate increases. And your parents love your staff, so you need to push that down the line. Supporting staff, investigating benefits, adding new curriculum. You're doing it anyway. I know you're doing it because you have to do it every year. So it's just a communication process, and be sure that you get that communicated along with the tuition rates. Okay, let's talk about what to do if you've gotten behind. All right, so here's some creative ideas I've heard recently. And some of them I've used on my own and have found them to work well. First of all, if you've gotten behind $20 a week and you feel out like, and you've investigated and done your analysis, and that's where your tuition rates need to be, raise your current families $10 a week, because that's probably the tolerance level, but raise new families $20 a week. So at that point, new families can make the decision to enroll or not. They're not with you already, so if you have a rate that's $20 more than current families pay, then they can make the decision to come or not. Communicate that to your current families, that you, in an effort to support them, have gotten to the place where costs have risen to the point where you need to increase $20 a week to new families. But in support of them and appreciation for their being with you, I've also heard a couple of providers who did it just for families who had been with them more than a certain amount of time, which I thought was a good idea too. But just increase them $10. So be sure they know what they're getting. And then I've had people say that how they can make up for that is that as those children get promoted to less expensive programs, because typically we would be in an industry where infants, so we use the 3 tuition rate as a baseline. Typically you would have an infant rate at about $20 higher, somewhere between 10 and 20. I see it go up drastically more than that in some parts of the country, but at least that. Toddlers would be a little less than infants. And by the time they get to the 3- and 4-year-old program, you've got a good solid baseline. Most after-schoolers would pay about half of the 3-year-old rate, which is where you can really, if you serve after-schoolers, really do well financially and balance out some of those infants, which are typically loss leaders. So at lower ratios, you're usually losing money on infants and toddlers, doing okay is really the sweet spot 3s, 4s, and in some parts of the country we're still excuse me, doing 5-year-old kindergarten. But the after school, you know, they're there 3.5 hours a day and half the rate. So that's a good model. So as they promote to different age groups, then you go ahead and increase them to your going rate. And they probably still got a little bit of a break, but not as much as they would have. So I thought that was a pretty creative idea as well. Another thing you might do is a more drastic increase in infants. That's kind of a tricky one because infants seem to be feast or famine. You know, you're either completely full, or you don't know where the infants are, so you need to be sure that you're not keeping people out of that. I'm not sure that the tuition rate is the most important factor in that. It just seems like some natural cycles. But you can always raise infants to the place where, you know, it's a good solid market rate. And again, it's because those families are not with you yet. They can check the competition, and you need to be able to sell them well when they come to tour, and that's another conversation, and a lost area of opportunities. I'm going to stop right now because I have to say this. I get on a couple of soapboxes. I do a lot of secret shopping in my work and can count on one hand the number of blow-away tours I've been given when someone didn't know who I was, so I was secret shopping. And it's such a simple thing. I mean, it's taking the time, making that person important, involving your teachers in the process, and that's outside of the scope of this too. So I'll get back to infants. The other thing is to make changes in other charges other than tuition rates and in discounts, which we'll get to next. Okay, so let's talk about other things that you charge other than tuition. Let's talk about annual fees just a little bit. So some of the things that some schools charge annually are registration fees, supply fees, insurance fees. When I hear people just charge registration fees initially, I encourage them to go to an annual fee there. Parents seem to be able to tolerate that pretty well. Some people like to call those supply fees or insurance fees. You really need an explanation for those. You know, if it's a supply fee, what is it for? Is it for art materials? Is it for curriculum consumables that you have to buy every year? And insurance, really only if you carry accident insurance for children. I'm seeing a real move away from that. Most companies now just have their families use their own health insurance if there's an accident in the school, and that transition seems to be going well. So if you haven't done that, you might want to, but if you have accident insurance still in place, that's always a good logic for registration fees. I see annual registration fees as an amount all over the place, anywhere from $50 to $150, and that's a big range, probably with 70 to 80, maybe 70 to 100 is kind of a norm. It's a great way to, and really do use that when it's registration time to replenish your school and update some things. So if you've done those annually, consider that. I get the question a lot about what do you do if someone enrolls in the spring and then you have an annual registration in the fall. My suggestion would be to charge them the full registration initially, but if they've registered within the last 6 months, you might want to prorate that somehow in the fall, maybe just half, or maybe a quarter if they just paid it in the last quarter. So those are some ideas. Late payment fees. This is a big one, really, and we'll talk a lot more about this in April when we talk about accounts receivable control, but most people's typical policy would be that tuition is due on Monday, it's late on Tuesday, and there's a late fee assessed when it's paid at that time. These amounts are usually about $25 a week. I see those go as high as $40. I encourage owners to let their director say the computer does it. Because it's really a lot of people, especially the very nice people in our industry, have trouble asking for money because they're so nice. But you have to be very consistent about this. And if you think about the amount of time and energy it takes you and your team to track down people's payments, believe me, it costs you more than $25 to $40 just to do that. So be very consistent about those, but lots more information about that in April, so plug in there. Late pickup fees, again, if your closing time is 6, I typically see $1 a minute per child as a charge after your closing time. If you have a parent that's great and called and said, stuck in traffic, had a flat tire, going to be 10 minutes late, it's never happened before, maybe you reconsider that. If you've got a family that's consistently late, they didn't let you know, you're probably in an overtime situation by then, another no-no in my opinion. So overtime should be reserved only for emergencies, not as a consistent business practice. That's outside the scope of this one too. But definitely charge that late pickup fee immediately. And most people will not let the child return even on the next day without having that. Maybe they can bring it in the next morning, but it needs to be paid immediately. Return check fees is another one. The bank is charging you if you're processing checks and they're returned. Lots of move to electronic payments now, and love that. So that's helped a lot with return check fees, but the bank is charging you, and it is costing you when you have to go track that family down in the redeposit or get that repaid. So $25 to $40 is another good rule of thumb there, and be sure that you're doing those consistently as well. So really want to spend the last couple of minutes on the discounts, because as I said, I'm seeing some changes in discounts that make a more dramatic change in the financial picture than anything else we've talked about, even raising tuition rates. So a couple of things to consider here. First of all, staff discounts. This industry uses staff childcare discounts as the main employee benefit. And it's because really it's, it's easy, and it's historically been what we could afford the most. Typical would be free childcare for a director and half-price childcare for everyone else. And so a few things have changed there. I'm a big fan of that, actually. I think that it's one of the ways we get great teachers. They want their children with them. They want to get the discount, have them there. But there's really a limit to how much of this you can do, and it will sneak up on you really quickly. My suggestion, a couple of ideas. So a couple of companies have instigated limits on the number of children that can be discounted in the school at all. So maybe 5. It's really tough to go over about that because you've got a whole classroom pretty soon. Some ways to do that are that you might limit the number of children an individual employee can have as discounted. I would suggest 2. You might limit the age group that can be discounted. It's really difficult to discount infants and toddlers, so maybe you limit that as well. I get the question sometimes, what if I need to hire someone and I have 5 and that's my rule? Well, you can hire them anyway. You can just say we have 5 discount slots available in the school. We'd love to have you, and when one frees up, you're first. But right now, you'll have to pay full price child care. So just some thoughts. That's a tough one, I know, because it's really tough to get great staff. So, but financially, that can be a challenge. The multiple child discount. So with families with more than one child, usually I'll see 10% of the second or subsequent children on the less expensive program. So the most expensive program pays full tuition, 10% on subsequent children. Used to see a little bit of 10% on the total, but not so much anymore. Most everyone will charge full price on the most expensive one. Industry discounts. Some people will give discounts to a particular industry if it's in their area. My suggestion there is I really like this one, but be sure that you're getting some value from that industry. So be sure that that industry is promoting you to their employees. Otherwise, they're just going to come to you anyway. So you need to get some traffic driven or some positive press, some kind of collaboration with that industry, or you're probably going to get those parents anyway. Typical would be a 10% discount. Any more than that is tough financially. And sometimes 10% is really tough if you have a large volume of people from that industry. But I do like that one. I think that can serve you well and get you some enrollment. Subsidy discounts, we talked a little bit about already, and that some states and some places you aren't able to charge full tuition for subsidized children. so you have to give discounts. I would charge it in your system that way, full fare less a scholarship discount. And again, use that in your marketing materials. We scholarshiped over X dollars last year to support families. And lastly, and I get on a soapbox about this one too, if you are allowing any days that parents don't pay for, holidays, free days in any form, vacation days, stop doing that. You're still paying your staff. You're paying your staff for holidays. You're paying them for vacation days. If you're not, move toward that, because it'll make it very difficult to not find the right people. But this is one thing that you can instigate with a change with your tuition rate. So a good suggestion in this one might be to do a tuition rate increase, maybe communicate to parents that to get to market, you need to get to a $20 increase, but in support of them, you're going to limit that this year to $10. However, in order to better support our teachers, we will eliminate vacation or holiday free days, because we are still responsible to pay staff and want them to have that revenue. Families can swallow that at the time. They probably will forget next summer when they go on vacation, and you'll have to go through it again. But if, just 1 year, you have to go through that, and that makes a significant financial difference. So pay attention to the discounts. That is the end of our prepared information. I'm going to pull up questions now and see what we have. Again, there is a chat bar over to the right-hand side of your screen. There you can click on the plus icon and ask a question. Okay, so question, going to another computer. What do you think about offering discounts on tuition at the end of a tour to secure a family? Interesting. Tough one. I probably would be a little negative toward offering a discount to secure a family coming in, especially if you just wowed them with a tour. I really used to say to my directors, if somebody comes in your door, really, they should be yours. I mean, if you get the opportunity to tour them and speak with them individually, they should really be yours. So once you start discounting, especially if you've already fallen behind, I think that's a tough one. So probably a little bit negative about that. And if you think about what we said earlier, that at a 70% occupancy, you should be able to make a 12 to 15% bottom line. If you start discounting 10 to 15%, you just really put yourself right back in the same situation. So we're a low margin industry, and I think it's really tough to make a discount meaningful without giving away everything and putting yourself in a tough financial position. But thanks for the question. What are the pros and cons of barter or trading services and products in exchange for tuition? Well, technically it's illegal, so let me just get that out there right now. It happens. So I do know people who trade lawn care, advertising, so it happens. I would be remiss to advise you to do that, because that's technically, the IRS frowns upon that. So thanks for the question. Let's see. What do you think about part-time schedules and parents wanting to switch days? What about a switch fee to change the day? Okay, good question. Part-time schedules are tough to work with, but work with them. So if you're not completely full, let people enroll on a part-time basis with the understanding that once you get enrollment to the place where it needs to be full-time, they need to make a decision. They'll have to either go full-time or disenroll, if you can use that spot. If you can coordinate it well, always charge more so you know, if you have someone come 3 out of 5 days, always charge more than 3/5 of your regular tuition, maybe 4/5. And if you can offset that with a person that comes 2 days a week and you charge them 3/5, then, you know, you're making more in the aggregate. It's tough to do, though, for exactly the reason that I think is the second part of this question, which is what do you do when they want to switch days? As long as you can work with people because you have the availability in your classroom, certainly charge a fee to switch days because you're having to staff for that. And I would certainly charge a fee to do that, but as you get more full in your enrollment, eliminate as much of that as possible. It's disruptive to the classroom. It's tough for you to manage, and financially it's not the best model for you and your company. Let's see, is the financial analysis tool you spoke about at the beginning available? Thank you for that. Yes, it is. So go to our website. You can register there for the financial model. It's an Excel spreadsheet. We're happy to send it to you with any support or explanation. Again, it was made so that you can put in the specifics of your school and the expenses will populate. And every school is different, so you know this is not gospel. This is just a comparison of what the average school would do in your situation. Some schools are going to have buses to pay for, and some aren't because they don't have any. You know, they don't have any transportation. Some will serve infants, and some won't. So there's some families will bring food, and some will serve a full meal and 2 snacks. So there's some differences in it, but it can be used as a benchmarking tool. And again, we're happy to support with anybody's particular situation. Let's see. Is there a standard formula to calculate cost per child based on ratios? I've been trying to get a ballpark figure based on child's age and ratio. I think this would be helpful in answering scholarship requests. Cost per child based on ratios. Yeah, I just saw this model done actually in the seminar that I was in, that I wasn't the person actually presenting, and I thought it was interesting. I've always kind of shied away from that, but I think that there could be a way to do that if you projected. So what you would have to do there is you would have to separate your fixed cost for things like utilities and rent and insurance and things that are there regardless of the number of children in the building from your variable costs, which are things like salaries and supplies and food. My problem with it really is that when I try to do those models, you have to have a staff member, whether there's, you know, in an infant room, whether there's 1 infant or 4 infants. So it's really challenging to know what that cost. If there's 1 in there, that 1 infant pays for the entire salary. If there are 4, you can split it 4 ways. So it's a little bit tough. I haven't seen a model that I like that's perfect, but I have seen one recently that I'm happy to pass along. So if you guys have one, please share it with me and I'll pass it along to the group. So really good question. Thank you. How do you change from monthly to weekly? I guess that means in charging tuition. Actually, I wouldn't. And so if that's the question, the real move in the industry, and this is a tricky one too, so you need to really be in a demographic area that can support this. There's a real move from weekly fees to monthly fees. And in some cases, I even have some that charge annual fees. And along with that, less of an interest in getting checks. Most people will take cash from anyone because it's cash and you need to say yes. But to move to an automatic draft or EFT system is a big trend in the industry as well. So if that's the question, I'd go in the other direction. Let's see, what else we have. Would you be able to post the variable fixed model on your website for us? Yes. So answer that, I think already. It is on our website, and we'd love for you guys to grab it and let us know what you think. Give us some feedback and tell us how we might modify that to make it more and more useful for you as you go. Let's see. Scroll up here for a few more. So also good question. Someone missed the first part of this, so let me just say this again, that this recording and video, as well as the healthy expense controlling that we did in November, will be able to be accessed from our website. But give us a week or two. We had so many participants for this one. We were limited to 100, and we had 100. And so we're thrilled about that, but we decided after that to post these on the website, and we're working with the logistics of that now. So keep an eye on that for the next week or two, and we hope to have those up, and you should be able to view those there. How do we charge for part-time rates? How do you know you're charging enough? Again, what I would do is always limit part-timers to open slots that you can't fill with a full-timer, and with understanding that they will have to go full-time if you get to that place. Always charge more. I don't really have a strong rule of thumb. You know, again, if it's maybe 3/4 of the full-time rate for a half-time rate is kind of how I like to see it. Maybe 4/5 of the rate for 3 days, 3/5 for 2 days. Just be sure that the rate is more than it would have been if you would have just cut it into that amount. Do you have a sample rate increase letter? I do, and I forgot to mention that. So we have several things that we mentioned today. One is a sample rate increase letter, although you have to fill in the specifics with, you know, the wonderful things that you did in the rate increase. The second letter that we have that I like a lot, if you want to get a jump start on your our April webinar, we have a letter if you've fallen behind in charging late fees and collecting your money to get people caught up. And basically the letter says, we, you know, due to the amount of time that we've had to spend in collections, here is our policy, beginning, and I like, you know, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks, we will charge this fee consistently. Because what I see is that most everyone has a policy. People who are in trouble just aren't following the policy. And I mean, not them charging the late fee. So be sure that you give them enough time, and then you do it very consistently. And just like your children, if you say you're going to do something, then you don't do it, you've lost it. So you've got to be very consistent. That's something you have to follow up on. Please email us if you'd like either of those letters. We'll be happy to forward those on. Let's see. I'm on a monthly billing schedule. Is it more prudent to move to a weekly? I think we addressed that. I see value in weekly billing when there are 22 or 23 date months. Okay. Okay, good question. So really, if you're going, first of all, I wouldn't change from monthly to weekly unless there's a financial advantage, and maybe there is if you do the conversion correctly. I'd continue with monthly just because it's less administratively for you to do, but definitely do the day conversion. So if you're going to go from weekly to monthly, you're not just going to multiply the weekly rate by 12. You've got to multiply it by 52 and divide by 12, because there are 4 extra weeks in the month that you would, in the year, that you would be losing there. So be sure you do that conversion correctly to a monthly and you're not losing those weeks. That would be devastating. Let's see, one up here at the top. A multiple site operation, there's a corporate office. How much should our total corporate expenses be, including wages, say a percent of the total revenue? We're currently running 10. Good question. I mean, if you've got some multi-site people out there, so that's really, I like 8. But I'd say 8 on a normalized basis for overhead, you know, and for overhead is typically everyone outside of the center director down, so center assistant, teachers, everything that happens within a particular school. Anyone else would be considered overhead or upper level management. You can probably normalize at 8, but when I say normalize, most companies that are multi-site are in a constant state of growth. So as you grow and you get to 8, you need to add another person, so now you're back down, or you're down to, you know, you're spending more, it's at 12. you got to get a couple more schools to get it back to 8 again. So, and maybe I did that in the opposite direction than I should have. But so, 8 to 12. I used to hear some companies that were at 5. I think they were a little too lean. I've seen some at 15. I think that's tough to deal with. It's a lot, but somewhere in there. 8 to 10, maybe 12. Good question. How do you know you're charging enough? Again, really good question. So I think you have to back into it. And I'm happy to help anyone do this because it's, again, it'll be a little more extensive to calculate and a little outside of the scope of this hour. But what you really want to do, in theory, you want to take what your actual financial picture is and what you're spending and back into it. So we're actually spending this. Also, there's some things we like to do to project the occupancy to a certain level, so we kind of normalize that. It's really hard if you're at 50% occupancy. It's really hard to make all of your expenses fall in place, and it's hard to add that to figure out what your tuition rate should be because your financial picture is unstable. So we really like to set it at 70%. Figure out what you're spending. We know what your capacity is. Then we can back into the tuition rate. So at this level of service and in this capacity, in order to generate a healthy bottom line, here's what your tuition rate needs to be. I think you can, if you're good at Excel and figuring out formulas, you can take our financial pro forma and play around with it and do that. We're happy to support and help with that a little bit. So I would take it from that perspective, though. Let's see if we have any more. I think we may have hit the questions. You say that the competition doesn't matter, but my competitor is a national school. They charge $10 less than me, and they probably have cheaper files. What do you suggest? I wouldn't be afraid of it. I'd stay right where you are. If you're priced right with the quality of your service and the quality of your teachers, and you are not wasting. So that's another way the financial pro forma can fall in place and let you benchmark your expenses as a percent as compared to other companies. So if you're frugal but you're good and you're not wasting, don't be afraid of being more than the competition, no matter who they are. I say this in a bold manner, but also not afraid of competition coming in. If you're good, your house is in order, if a competitor comes and shares your fence line, maybe a few families will go over there and they will most likely be back quickly, or you will replace them with someone else. So competition is not a concern, I don't think, as long as your house is in order and you're doing the right things. Let's see if we have one more. How do we determine a benchmark for how many administrative personnel we should be paying for on a 1.6 million revenue center? Currently have director, assistant director, and accountant. I really like to use number of children in the school as opposed to the revenue. What that says to me is you've got a very healthy revenue and you can afford 3. And I suspect that with that revenue, your capacity and enrollment is at the threshold I'm about to talk about. I think schools who have less than 100 capacity really struggle to have more than one administrator. At the 60 to 70 capacity, probably you just need one full-time person. It's really hard to afford more than that. I would suggest naming an assistant director and have them trained, but they're probably also a teacher. Once you get closer to 80 to 100, that teacher probably needs to be pulled out of the classroom half of the day. So maybe you have them as a teacher in the morning, they support the director, and are out of the classroom in the afternoon, so you have about 1.5. By the time you get to 120 to 150, you need a full-time director and full-time assistant. When you start getting, closer to 200, 160 to 200, at least the part-time person that helps with record keeping is common, but they could be a person that helps with anything. So they could be a person that manages training or manages curriculum or writes lesson plans or helps support in that way. But you're getting to the 2.5 range by then. 200 plus, you've got to have 3. I've seen some of the new mega schools that are 400 capacities that have 5 to 6 full-time people up front. So I really like that decision more in the number of families that you have to support and the amount of work that there is to do that. So that's a little bit better to do it. Healthy bottom line should be 10% question mark. Again, I want to see you guys do great. So here are kind of my rules of thumb. At 50 to 60% occupancy, you should break even. And most people will start their schools with a financial situation that does that. At 70%, I'd like to see you modeled to have a bottom line of 12 to 15%. And remember again that a bottom line means that you have the funds to reinvest, because financial statements don't typically show the bus that you just bought and the large things that you do and remodeling, and so you've got to have constant resources and reinvestment in your company. Over that amount, most every new enrollment will fall to the bottom line. It's rare. It happens, but it's rare that I see a company go above a 30% bottom line. It's just tough in our industry. When we spend 50 to 55% of every dollar that parents pay on staffing, and of course that percent goes down as your revenue goes up, but to go over that amount is really tough. So healthy bottom line to me is 15%. Really good at 20. If you can get in the 22 range, I think you're spectacular. And then there's the rare school that gets between 20 and 25 and 30. So hopefully that helps a little. One more here. I can't see the time for that. Okay, have 2 part-time receptionists, also have full-time cook, full-time maintenance. Are these wages included in the 728K staff cost benchmark on the spreadsheet? Okay, someone looking at the spreadsheet here. It's all relative, really, so they're asking about specific positions. I don't consider cooks and maintenance personnel to be overhead. First of all, those should be counted in your regular wages, and yes, they would be included there. Some people will put maintenance. It could be, if it's an employee, maybe you make a separate line for it, because most people would contract that out, and it would show up in a maintenance line and not a salary line. So maybe if it's a salary, you just do a separate line for it, so you can separate the two and manage them, that way, so that you know that it's maintenance. But those people, your cook definitely should be included in that number that we're shooting for. And remember, when you're looking at the financial valuation spreadsheet, your dollar number is going to be different, because that's based off our percentage. So where we want to see salaries is in the 42 to 45%, and that's at a school that has a healthy enrollment. So look less at the number and more at the percent, unless you've already put your numbers in there. So just be sure you're managing your salaries and food and variable expenses by a percent and not a dollar amount. So I think that's the end of our hour. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your questions. Please give us some great feedback. We love it, whatever it is, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone in April on the 23rd, where I will get back on the soapbox about accounts receivable. Thanks, and have a great day.